use of armor to combine striking power with mobility and protection is as old as war. The weapons alter and the ways in which they're used, but the men in armor do not change. The knight on his horse, the Royal Armoured Corps trooper in his tank, there's not much difference in the sheer fighting guts he needs. Today, the main strength of the Royal Armoured Corps is organized in armored brigades equipped with tanks like these Comets. In addition, there are the armored car regiments, usually one to every corps or armored division. Then there are the divisional regiments, RAC. These regiments form part of the infantry division. Armored recovery vehicles like this Churchill are used by tank units for first-line recovery work. Other Armoured Corps regiments use specialized equipment like the Crocodile flamethrower for infantry support, or flails for mine clearance, or obstacle crossing devices such as the Churchill Fascine, and bridge-laying tanks. During the last war, a tank was even developed for use with airborne troops, and amphibious vehicles were designed for many tasks. There is a special armored establishment for conducting user trials and developing tactics on all these equipments. All the time, work is proceeding on the design and development of new armored vehicles. At the end of the First World War, only 30 men were permanently employed on the experimental development of new tanks. Today, a large number of technicians, engineers, scientists and soldiers work together at the Ministry of Supply Fighting Vehicle Design Establishment. Here are developed the prototype tanks to meet the needs of the Armoured Corps men who are going to use them. Here, too, tanks captured from the enemy in wartime give up their secrets in the finest equipped testing bays in Europe. All this experimental work is vital for our tank supremacy. Men of the Royal Armoured Corps have to undergo highly specialized training to reach the necessary standard of efficiency. For this purpose, the RAC Centre exists. At some period in their army career, most RAC men visit one or both of the camps at Bovington or Lulworth. The technical training of the modern tank soldier includes instruction on mechanical vehicles and in driving. The tank driver must be able to control and maintain his vehicle and must have a good eye for ground. Although he receives directions from the tank commander over the intercom, the driver is still responsible for keeping his tank going under all conditions. Communication is by wireless, the nerve system of the armoured regiment, and most tank soldiers are taught wireless procedure and maintenance. The principles and practice of tank gunnery are taught both on sub-caliber weapons on miniature ranges and on the open ranges with live ammunition. Training is broken down into stages, and each stage must be mastered before passing on to the next. Great importance is placed on AFV recognition. Models, silhouettes, films, film strips and other aids are all used to show the many different types of armour likely to be met and to give the familiarity necessary for instant recognition. RAC men must, of course, be expert map readers. Allied to map reading and air photo interpretation are scanning, searching, and visual memory, making all the difference between mere looking and intelligent observation. Every man in the Corps must be a technician and, first and foremost, a soldier.
They sent me to Bovington on a course after I'd been called up. I've always been interested in tanks, ever since I was a kid. It runs in the family. My dad was the driver of one of the first tanks that went into action in 1916. Well, the day after I arrived at Bovington, I went to have a look at what must be the strangest museum in the world, a place where they keep old tanks of historic interest. When I got inside, I ran into an old civvy who was taking a look round.
In 1482, Leonardo da Vinci drew a design for one. You can read what he says under there.
I'm building secure and covered chariots which are invulnerable. And when they advance with their guns into the midst of the foe, even the largest enemy masses must retreat, and behind them the infantry can follow in safety and without opposition.
He had the right idea, hadn't he? And yet nearly 5 centuries passed before a tank went into action.
It was a historic moment, all right, when the old Mark I first appeared. That was the type of tank your dad and I fought in. There were 2 sorts. The male, with a 6-pounder in each sponson, and the female, which carried machine guns. These first tanks were manned by the Machine Gun Corps, and in those days had a crew of 8. We reckoned they'd be the answer to the stalemate of trench warfare. It was no fun being inside them, I can tell you. We went along at about 3 miles an hour, half choked by engine fumes, and the noise was terrible. I remember the first time we used tanks. It was on the Somme in 1916. We were up before dawn, seeing to the guns and ammunition, oiling and greasing the suspensions, and generally getting ready for the attack. The pal of mine in the infantry told me what the tank looked like. There she was, he said, groaning along, poking her nose here and there, going on very slow, but over everything. It was her slowness which scared the Boche as much as anything, and the way she shook her wicked old head and stopped a cough.
Our attack was successful, all right, but it's a great pity we weren't kept back for a bit until more tanks were available. They ought to wait until hundreds of tanks could be used all at once. The element of surprise was lost.
In 1917, we became known as the Tank Corps, and they gave us a new badge just to cheer us up for the 3rd Battle of Wipers. We certainly needed something to cheer us up. The battle was fought in a swamp, and we spent most of the time trying to get the tanks out of the mud with the old unditching beams they all carried. And if that didn't work, well, we had to pull them out. It wasn't until the Battle of Cambrai that we got our first real chance to show what tanks could do. The whole of the Tank Corps in France, nearly 500 machines, attacked the Hindenburg line. While we were doing our maintenance, a special order was read out. Tomorrow, the Tank Corps will have the chance for which it has been waiting for many months to operate on good going in the van of battle. The reserve force for this battle was the old Cavalry Corps. I always hated seeing horses on the battlefield. Of course, I never thought then that the cavalry would ever fight in tanks.
What happened in the battle?
Well, we smashed through 15,000 yards of the enemy defense lines in 22 hours. I remember the leading tank flew the brown, red and green Tank Corps pennant. And you know what those colours mean, all right? Through mud and blood to the green fields beyond. We were a big surprise to the Jerrys, and we gave them a good hiding. And I'll tell you the reason in one word. Cooperation. Between us and the other arms. And especially between us and the infantry.
Yes, Cambrai Day will never be forgotten by tank men. Celebrated on the 20th of November. Last Cambrai Day, I got through 20 pints. Here, have a look at this whippet tank, son. Whippet tanks were first used in March 1918 and were very successful. They're very much lighter and faster than previous tanks. They had a crew of 3 and mounted 4 machine guns. This actual tank, standing here, was the one in which Lieutenant Sewell won the VC in August 1918.
What about armoured cars?
They were used by the Machine Gun Corps from 1914 onwards. Later they were manned by Tank Corps personnel. This car and a great many others of the same type were used right throughout the First World War. Between the wars they fought in India and China. In the Second World War they were still in use and fought in the Western Desert. They were then sent back to England and used by the Home Guard till the Home Guard was disbanded. What do you think of that, eh?
Pretty good.
The other cars are peerless, and those are the ones we saw most of in France.
Armoured cars were also used a lot in Alamein campaign in the Middle East. They were formed into mobile patrols for scouting in the desert, and they went right behind the enemy's lines, just like the armoured cars in North Africa in the last war. It's a pity the tanks were never used more like that. In France, we were always a kind of battering ram for cracking open the enemy defences. We had to slog along with the infantry.
Did you ever come across any Jerry tanks?
Yes, son, I did. And they weren't a match for ours by a long chalk. Tin boxes, that's all they were. You can't wonder that the Jerry crews didn't have any confidence in them. Our own tanks were in action right up to 1918. Some of the Jerry brass hats even said it was British tanks that won the war. If they'd said it was British cooperation, they'd have been about right.
Cooperation? That's what he said, did he? Well, I wish you'd cooperate with us a bit more, mate, and get in this plate on. Sorry, chap. What else did this old civvy character tell you?
He told me that as soon as the war was over, tanks were forgotten about. Tank design came almost to a halt. The old civvy told me that although very little was done about new tanks, a lot was done about new armoured tactics. It was us who started the idea of a tank brigade operating as a single mobile force. Exercises were held every year on Salisbury Plain.
Yes, and who first put that idea into practice in war? I can tell you, mate. The Germans, when they went into Poland.
Yeah, and they used it in France and Belgium in 1940. I was in the cavalry, you know. When the Royal Armoured Corps was formed in 1939, we were brought into it. They took away our horses and gave us light tanks. We didn't think much of them noisy bits of scrap iron to begin with. We soon got used to them. Adaptable, that's what we were. As a matter of fact, we got quite fond of them in the end. Where was you when the war began?
I was out in Libya from the start. Of course, we had one thing in common with you BEF types. There were far more of the enemy than there was of us. Or at any rate, his tanks carried bigger guns. So our game was to keep cracking and never get pinned down. Anyway, it didn't stop us from bursting through his lines just when we wanted to. We may only have had 2-pounders, but we knew how to use them. I reckon we'd have cleared Jerry and the I-Ties right out of Africa. Only, of course, we never had the stuff. Not until later. As it was, we kicked him out of Libya twice. I was in armoured cars myself. Talk about mobile warfare. I reckon an armoured car's the handiest thing to have around in the desert. Somebody else must have thought so too. They certainly give us enough to do. Whenever the CO had a conference on, we'd wonder what was cooking. And there'd be quite a bit of betting on what the next trip would be. We'd find out soon enough when our troop leader put us in the picture. We used to go out on recce trips, miles behind the enemy lines, sometimes for days and even weeks at a time. When you live in close together for as long as that, you soon learn to muck in. It helps a lot when the dirt's flying to know the rest of your crew and feel you can depend on them. When I say crew, I mean officers as well. They mucked in with us too. They were a good bunch, our officers, and the better we know them, the more we felt we could rely on them. There wasn't much traffic in the desert, and often there'd only be us and an Itai or Jerry plane about, and nothing else for miles. We didn't sit around asking for it. We were too dodgy for that. One Jerry even tried to get us by swinging a bomb on a long piece of rope under his plane. He was never on target, though, and after a bit he blew up his bomb on a rock. Sometimes, though, we did see the enemy, and if we could, we brewed them up, or else hung around and reported their movements by wireless.
What sort of tanks did you have?
Well, of course, we had armoured cars, Daimlers and Umbers. The tanky boys had Matildas, Crusaders, Valentines, all a lot. They had a lot of hard work keeping them going, too. Then, gradually, we began to realize things were looking up. We'd hear of a new division in the desert, or see a unit equipped with Shermans. They were new tanks then, or Priest SPs. There were some Shermans in our division, and we were certainly glad to see them. They packed some punch with their 75mm guns, and of course they had an all-round Traverse. Kings of the Desert, we called them in the end. What with new equipment and checking the guns and ammo and all the rest of it, we guessed we were in for a party. And we knew we were in for one when we saw the brass hats up in the desert on the job. And when our troop leaders started briefing us, we knew the party couldn't be far off. It turned out to be a party, all right. The Battle of El Alamein. The gunners started it with a hell of a barrage, and after that we were all in it together. Infantry, tanks, sappers and all. For the first time in the war we had a lot of armour, and we used it in a mass. After the battle, we began collecting prisoners. We just took away their weapons and told them to walk east. They all obliged. Some of them hadn't much choice after we'd been at their tanks and transport. We passed packets of knocked-out Jerry tanks and 88s by the roadside as we followed the Afrika Korps right up to the Tunisian border. Phew, that was a ride, all right. 1,500 miles across the desert. Some bloke once said tanks in the desert were a tactician's paradise and a quartermaster's hell. He wasn't far wrong either, but the RASC types never let us down. Somehow or other they always come through. And up would come our B echelon in the evening. Mail first, that was the important thing, of course. Then the usual bully and water and petrol and ammo. When we were really running wild, we'd take on 3-day supplies and launch out into the blue. I take off my hat to our echelon boys. They rode around the desert in their 3-tonners with petrol and ammo aboard for the tanks and armoured cars. And often they had to come right up into the firing line to refuel us. Not very funny sitting on the edge of a battle with a load of petrol or ammo under you. We pushed west as fast as we could, but it wasn't plain sailing. Plenty of jerry rearguards with tanks and 88s, and of course, our armour was always at the sharp end. But we didn't really get held up till we got to the Marath line. After the attack on the line started, we were sent round Jerry's flank, by night too. I shan't forget that trip in a hurry. The whole of our division was switched across the front from right to left, and we didn't have any headlights to help us either. We crashed through during the night, and at first light the next day we were right among the Jerrys. We'd given them a left hook where it hurt, and they started pulling back to Tunis pretty quickly. Tunisia wasn't a bit like the desert. There were hills and plenty of scrub and trees, and it was green. That's what struck us most after the desert, the greenness of everything. Then we met up with the First Army. When we got into the hills, we saw what they'd been up against. It was terrible tank country, and the First Army had been there through the worst of the winter. That's where we saw the Churchills for the first time. They looked a bit funny to us, but the chaps inside swore by them. They were just the job for supporting infantry in that sort of country. We came up alongside the First Army in the hills around Tunis, and the final attack was a combined effort by the tanks of 1st and 8th Armies. It was a wonderful sight, all those tanks. I'd no idea there were so many tanks in the whole British Army. Yes, we certainly hit the enemy for 6 right out of Africa. It felt grand to have done it at last, after 3 years. But it's funny, I've often missed the desert since.
What would you say won the African campaign, Bob?
I'd say the chief thing was cooperation. I agree with your old civvy about cooperation in warfare. Mind you, another thing with us was confidence. Not only confidence in our equipment, but confidence in ourselves and the old darn setup. Oh, I'll tell you another important thing. Physical fitness.
Aye, that counts all right. Before we went to Burma, our CO was dead keen on PT. We had bags of it. And when we got there, we certainly needed to be fit. We couldn't fly over the mountains and jungles. It was up one side and down the other for us. On roads if they were clear. If they weren't, we had to clear them the best way we could. And it's not till you try hacking your way through the Burma jungle that you know what hard labor is. On top of it all, there was the filthy climate. Sometimes it was so hot we could have fried eggs on the tanks. That's if we had any eggs. On maintenance, we sweated like pigs. We must have lost pounds. Then there was the dust. It got in the tank tracks and in the food. And if there wasn't any dust, it meant there was rain. And in Burma, you don't need to hold out your hand to see if it's raining. It hits you on the head hard, and it makes plenty of mud. What with getting bogged down in the mud and trying to cross rivers as wide as the Firth of Forth without any bridges, we had plenty on our plate. You'd think we'd have given up using tanks and gone in for foot slugging, but we didn't. We pushed on with them. Sometimes we could only use them in 2s and 3s, and often only one at a time. And it's when tanks work on their own that you need to have your head screwed on the right way. And I don't only mean the chaps at the top.
It's the troop and crew commanders on the spot who have to use their loaf, and quickly too. Oh yes, we learnt a lot in Burma about working with the infantry, and we learnt it the hard way. I was a gunner myself most of the time, and I remember we often couldn't use HE owing to the danger of 3 bursts to our own blokes. My unit went right through to the end, but our big party was the taking of Mandalay. When we at last got in there, we felt good, I can tell you.
Yes, I must say you blokes in the jungle certainly put up a good show.
What about you in Northwest Europe? You were there, weren't you?
Ah, so was Bob here. The worst part about that was the waiting to go across to Normandy. Of course, we all knew what we were in for. We've been getting ready for it ever since Dunkirk. What we didn't know was when or where. Even when we moved into our concentration areas and aboard the LCT, it might have been another exercise. And we got our little books on France. That clinched it. When we got going, I pretty soon found out I was no sailor. When the sea got rough, I just stopped thinking. There was a lot of Jerry 8 on the beaches, but at least we didn't get our feet wet when we landed. We kept in our tanks and drove straight out of the LCTs as if we were driving down the ramp of the maintenance shed at home. It seemed a funny idea to be driving a tank through water, and I wasn't at all keen about it. But we reached the beach all right. I didn't see any other chaps sticking either, so all the waterproofing and training we had did us a bit of good after all. The beach was a shambles when we got there. Masses of stuff coming in and getting sorted out. We saw a lot of infantry landing, wading through the water. I certainly thanked my lucky stars I was in a tank. Inland from the beaches, we got in some pretty tough scrappings. Jerry wanted to push us off again. Couldn't blame him, really. When we heard the high-ups had landed, we knew we were there to stay. In our first arbor, we took time off to have photographs taken. Old Nobby, our gunner, tried his hand at a bit of French cooking. Well, the eggs were all right. We didn't have much time for resting before we were in our first real scrap. Our troop leader told us there were 6 panzer divisions in front of us. Moving up towards Caen, it looked as if we'd got as many on our side. So it was obvious there was going to be a big bang sometime or other. Of course, we weren't the first to have a crack at Caen. The Air Force had given it a good plastering before we got there. For all we knew, they might have hit it with an atom bomb, the way it looked. They didn't exactly improve the roads either. Yes, it was pretty tough going into Caen, in more ways than one. After the battle and found ourselves in a very different type of country. High banks and edges, not my idea of tank country. Then came Falaise. You've heard about Falaise, haven't you? We had Jerry surrounded and the RAF had the time of their lives. When we drove through, there were wrecked German tanks everywhere. I remember seeing some of our chaps giving themselves a ride on a Tiger. A tank, of course. After Falaise, we had to cross the Seine by kind permission of our sappers, who had bridges across at the double in place of the ones Jerry or the RAF had blown up. And then it was one big swan as far as Brussels. Outside Brussels, some of our armoured cars got so far ahead they were waved on by Jerry MPs. They soon put them in the bag. Brussels was all right. They were certainly pleased to see us. The only trouble was we couldn't stop off and accept some of the invitations. But Holland wasn't so good. The roads run along the top of dyke walls, and there's no cover. Jerry just waited for our tanks and picked them off like coconuts at a fair. The winter came on, and it was bitterly cold. We had to keep warm the best way we could. Mud and the slush didn't help the tanks much, but we were better off than the stuff on wheels. Came on to snow, too, and that was just about all we were short of. The book didn't tell us how to camouflage tanks without any white stuff, so we just had to improvise. I shan't forget Holland in a hurry. People were all right, but you can keep the climate. About the only way we could use tanks was supporting the infantry. It was bad country for them, and they needed all the help we could give them across those dikes. All the time, though, we were pushing steadily on. And after a bit, we crossed the German frontier. I got quite a kick out of that. It had been a long journey, but we were getting to the end of the road all right. You only had to have a look at some of the Jerry prisoners we took in Germany to know that. Some of the Jerrys didn't seem to like us much at first, especially the women. I suppose you couldn't blame them. I know a few old girls down in Camberwell who'd have had a lot to say if a Jerry tank came up Peckham Road.
Hey, look. They've got that old tank started at last. That's a Cambrai tank.
Since that September morning of 1916, when the first tank lumbered into action, British armour has always been ready to meet aggression with a steel fist. Behind the men of the Royal Armoured Corps lie the great traditions of its component units. The cavalry of the line, and the Royal Tank Regiment. Today, all these traditions belong to the Corps as a whole. They are the traditions of British men in armour.